With the white Negro, superficial reflections on the hipster, Norman Mailer came as close as he ever would to fulfilling his commission to make a revolution in the consciousness of our time. This 1957 essay is doubly prophetic. Prophetic in the lesser sense that it anticipated the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. Prophetic in the greater sense in that it provided part of the impetus for that revolution. But this grand prophetic accomplishment is undermined by two flaws in Mailer's theology: a proclivity for Manichaean dualities and an intoxication with the cult of redemptive violence. The square. Imagine a literal square, rectangular polygon, 4 sides, with a cultural avatar at each vertex. Bottom left lurks the hipster, a philosophical psychopath, Mailer's white Negro. To his right lounges the 1960s hippie. Above the hipster, top left, is placed the racially stereotyped Negro Mailer drew on for his essay. To this Negro's right, above the hippie, stands a radically different cultural understanding of what it was to be black in America. As my linear algebra professor was wont to say, the diagram commutes. That is, the same historical process that would transform the 1950s cultural stereotype of black America into the new Negro of the early 1960s would also transform hipster to hippie. And the same cultural dynamic that Mailer observed shaping the hipster in response to the 1950s Negro would shape the hippie in response to the new Negro. The Negro. The 1950s Negro stereotype is racist, both product of and instrument for the oppression of African Americans by a white supremacist culture. Mailer appropriates this stereotype none too critically. He was, however, careful to insist that any characteristics attributable to the stereotype are appropriate and understandable historical responses to this very oppression and are not intrinsically racial. The hippie and the hipster. Hipster and hippie have much in common. They share a lifestyle of bohemian squalor, unwillingness to delay gratification for vague promises of future happiness, antipathy toward established authority in general and squares in particular, and a profound affinity for sex and drugs. Both reject the authoritarian philosophies which now appeal to the conservative and liberal temper. And both drifted out with a black man's code to fit their facts. However, their differences are striking. The hipster's music was jazz, the hippie's was rock and roll. Both are sexed by other means, but jazz is a soft music of intricate improvisation appreciated by a self-selected elite of cognoscenti, while rock, a form emerging out of the American South, out of rhythm and blues, aka race music, and black gospel, is raucous, loud, rowdy, and proudly, audaciously, defiantly of and for the masses. If the hipster was driven by the search for an orgasm more apocalyptic than the one which preceded it, the hippie, as the vogue for tantric yoga illustrates, was doomed to experience his orgasm as failure. Failure to deliver on his subconscious promise that this time the ecstasy would last forever. The hipster's mysticism was a visceral response to despair. he chose to accept the terms of death as the only terms on offer in post-war America. The hippies was grounded in a fragile, ultimately ephemeral, but nonetheless quite real millenarian dream, a vision of a world transformed. The hipster embraced violence in his hopeless quest for self-liberation. The hippie rejected it as inconsistent with the liberated world he hoped to realize. The level of culturally sanctioned violence visited upon the hippie is indicative of his Negroness. The new Negro. What produced the historical shift from hipster to hippie, and why didn't Mailer see it coming? The answer to the first question is as simple as it is stark. If the only courage, with rare exceptions, the hipster had been witness to was the isolated courage of isolated people, the hippie came of age in the wake of one of the more spectacular instances of collective courage in human history, the American Civil Rights Movement. The black man's code, as white America understood it, transformed itself beyond recognition in the years following the publication of Mailer's essay. The Negro stereotype Mailer plucked from white America's oppressive and guilty unconscious, only to invert, valorize, and project into his hipster, gave way to a powerful, albeit fleeting, cultural image forged by the selfless action of the oppressed. This from David Harris in Witness to the Revolution. We were working in Quitman County. The county seat was called Marks. There was a 75-year-old black woman there who walked into the registrar of voters' office and said, "I want to register to vote." They arrested her, threw her in jail, tortured her with an electric cattle prod, and then released her from jail. She walked out of the jail and down the street to the registrar of voters' office and said, "I want to register to vote." This act of individual heroism and thousands like it were not isolated, nor were the individuals who undertook them. They knit together into a fabric of struggle that was and was understood to be righteous in both ends and means. That struggle resonated with a generation of young Americans, kindling a utopian fire that would enlighten their lives, at least for a while. They absorbed, often unconsciously and not always very deeply, the movement ethic of nonviolence, the movement lifestyle, minimalist, cooperative, committed, and above all, with its beloved community theology, meaningful, provided a powerful contrast to the vapid, if abundant, consumer culture from which they sought to escape. For a brief historical moment, an alternative America seemed possible. Blindness. I am almost embarrassed to even pose the second question. Why didn't Mailer see all of this coming? After all, only the tiniest handful of Americans, black or white, had an inkling of African America's capacity for collective nonviolent action. Why then should we expect Mailer to have been among them? Because central to this handful was the person of A.J. Musty, a man Mailer admired and with whom he had a cordial relationship. They sat together on the editorial board of Dissent, a magazine, by the way, that followed the emerging civil rights movement with considerable interest and some cautious hope. Musty saw quite clearly the applicability of Gandhian methods to the problems of race in America. He had not the slightest doubt about the ability of ordinary African Americans to adapt and employ these methods effectively. And he was not at all hesitant about sharing his convictions with anyone who would listen. Duality. Our question becomes, if you will bear with some mangled metaphors, why did Musty's clear vision fall on Mailer's deaf ears? To this, I have no definitive answer, but a few tentative speculations suggest them so. Surely it is unnecessary here to demonstrate Mailer's penchant for Manichaean dualities. However, let me give that dead horse one last gentle flog. Given his abhorrence for the totalitarian corporate liberalism he felt consolidating its grip on the so-called free world, it is not surprising that when Mailer definitively broke from the orbit of apologists for Stalin at the Waldorf Peace Conference in 1949, he did not join the Congress for Cultural Freedom, favoring the West against the East. It is somewhat surprising, though, that he did not denounce both the United States and the Soviet Union as distinct evils, the third camp position of Max Shachtman's Workers' Party. Nor did he uphold the orthodox Trotskyist formulation of the Socialist Workers' Party, that the Soviet Union was a degenerate workers' state. Instead, under Manichae's influence, no doubt, he adopted the line of a tiny and obscure sect of unorthodox Trotskyists, the Johnson-Forrest tendency, holding that both emerging superpowers were merely different manifestations of the same evil. Russia and America are moving radically towards state capitalism. The differences between them finally will be cultural differences, minor deviations. He could not bring himself to pronounce a plague on both your houses without muttering, they're really the same house anyway. It is as if the myth of Scylla and Charybdis had washed over Mailer without leaving a trace. Violence. His Manichaean predisposition misled him on the question of violence. He recognized as religious a primitive passion about human nature, his conviction that individual acts of violence are always to be preferred over the collective violence of the state. Mailer stumbled headlong into the not uncommon heresy that challenges the orthodox cult of redemptive violence's insistence on the blessed exercise of violence as the sole prerogative of the state, while at the same time valorizing other vectors of violence, validating their efficacy, morality, and vitality, and vindicating their power. Mailer believed this commitment to be profoundly transgressive, but here he was mistaken. The transgression was merely superficial. As he did with the stereotype of the Negro, Mailer seized on from his culture the pervasive trope that the violence of the state, its wars, its executions, is justified, while individual violence is reprehensible. With dramatic rhetorical defiance, he inverted the logic of the trope without questioning its content. Conclusion. Many centuries ago, a somewhat recalcitrant Jewish mystic experienced a grandiose compulsion he found difficult to explain, even to himself. Writing in the third person personal, he describes hearing the voice of God. Go now to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it. he went on to invoke the bizarre metaphor of being trapped in the belly of a large fish until he surrendered to the vision he could neither fully embrace nor repudiate. Thousands of years later, another mostly secular Jewish mystic could not comprehend, much less articulate, the source of his prophetic commission using the now limp and lifeless metaphor, God. Instead, he spoke of a writer's conceit, the rebellious imperatives of the self, and the navigator at the seat of being. Once again, Mailer's obsession with duality, here the dichotomy between society and self, obscured the truth. But is the underlying mystical experience he thought to communicate really all that different from Jonah's? The sour truth is that I am imprisoned with a perception that will settle for nothing less than making a revolution in the consciousness of our time. Mailer devotes his considerable energy, talent, and imagination to fulfilling this prophetic commission, but weaknesses in his theology limit his effectiveness.